Hello everybody. I'm Francesco Verso from Italy. I'm the moderator of this panel about empowering future communities. I am a science fiction writer and editor of future fiction. I've been working on the publishing sector for 10, 15 years. And lately I've developed a very big interest in Solarpunk, and that's why they put me here. So I'm very happy to introduce you to this panel, which is about, as I said, empowering future communities. The description of the panel goes like this. Solarpunk imagery tends to represent visions of solar panels and wind farms, but this only showcases large-scale projects. What does the path towards a fossil fuel-free future look like? How might we consider decentralization of power in quite literal terms? Could we and should we consider pathway to facilitate energy independence and autonomy at a community level? Okay, so to answer these very complicated questions, we have very skilled and expert panelists to help me sort out these questions. So I will ask you to introduce yourself to the audience. Please, Sophie, start.
Hi, everyone. Well, my name's Sophie Paul. I'm originally a geoscientist, and then I've been in IT and done a lot of organizational governance at all different kinds of organizations. And most recently, I've been involved in community renewable energy. And the project that I've been working on really solidly has been a community hydropower project. So that's a different kind of energy source. And that's on the River Thames in the UK, which is where I live. And a lot of that is about building community as well as building electricity scheme. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Joshua?
Hi, everybody. I'm Joshua Pearce. I'm a professor and chair of innovation at Western University, also on the River Thames in Canada, not in the UK. I run the FAST research group, and so this is an open source appropriate technology research group that focuses largely on solar photovoltaics, everything from the material science of the cells to cell design to manufacturing, even the racking and building entire systems and integrating them into the grid or leaving them off the grid. We provide all the plans and details, specifications, bill of materials, everything that you can build it yourself. And the work that we're doing is really trying to get to some of the kind of solar utopias that we read about in the science fiction. So I take a lot of inspiration from sci-fi and not only try to make it real within my own research, but then also to share back to the community by putting together stories talking about the technologies that we create. And I am a massive proponent and user of Appropedia, which is maybe a nice segue to our last speaker.
Oh, thank you. So, Emilio, tell us about yourself.
Hi, my name is Emilio Veli. I am an industrial engineer. I am based in El Salvador, where I'm from. And in the past, I worked in international development for a few years. So lots of my background has been in doing lots of community work here in El Salvador and also in other places regarding technology, resilience, and development. I mean, we call it international development in English, but for me, it's development in my country. And right now, for the past almost 3 years, I've been the executive director of the Appropedia Foundation, and we run Appropedia, a wiki for sustainability and development. And right now, I am fellow for the Green Web Foundation. So I'm working on a project that is very, very focused on internet practitioners and most specifically for the gig economy. So people who work in developing countries as contractors for internet companies trying to find out their carbon footprint and how to reduce it.
Cool, excellent. So we might start. The first part, of course, will be kind of questions that I will address to the panelists, and the second part will take some question from the audience. So if you want to write, just use the YouTube chat box, and we'll get it through. So my first question, of course, energy is such a huge issue and problem, especially in the last few years, from many different aspects, both from the sustainability and now from independence. So my first question is that we value things when we miss them the most. What would happen if we run out of fossil fuel in the next 40, 50 years? Or if it becomes so expensive that only the rich can afford it? On top of the usual blackouts and brownouts, what kind of practical resilience could be implemented? So I would like to start from Joshua.
Well, that's a good set of questions and packed tightly together. So I'll try to unpack it a little bit. I hope that we never get to the point that we run out of fossil fuels, because if we do, we've destroyed the climate and we're going to live in a much more challenging ecosystem. What I think or maybe a more hopeful solution is that we wean ourselves off them quickly, but we might do it in a way that causes a lot of social disruption. So just as an example, right now in most of the world, solar electricity can be produced at a lower cost than what is provided for by the grid. And one of the bigger concerns is that if the wealthiest people begin to put up solar and take care of themselves, their businesses and their kind of fancier homes, they have the option to grid defect, where they just leave the grid. And if you think about the grid, you create there's some cost involved in buying, say, fossil fuels like coal and burning it, and some in distributing that power to your house. And if more and more houses and more businesses leave the grid, then you'd be burning less fossil fuels, but you'd still need all the infrastructure. And so that would increase the costs. And so what you'd end up having is, the wealthiest would leave first, and then the cost of electricity would go up, which would push even more people towards some sort of distributed generation, probably solar, and maybe hydro, and maybe some wind too, but mostly solar. And then that increases the cost again, and more people leave, and who gets left holding the bag at the end? Well, it's the poorest people that didn't have the capital in order to be able to create the infrastructure. And so to me, that's a very real concern now, because basically everywhere that you run the economics, it makes more sense to generate a large fraction of your electricity with solar. And now with heat pumps and electric vehicles, we're moving towards a society that can be completely electrified, running off of renewable energy, and it's economic, but it does take initial capital to get there. And that is I think the fundamental challenge that we find ourselves in right now.
Oh, yeah, that's complicated indeed. Sophie, what about hydroelectricity?
Hydro, it really depends on where you are. Our government has just made community hydro impossible now. We've built ours just in time because of the amount you have to pay to find out whether your project is viable and gets planning permission or not has now become so high that it cuts off projects even starting. And then you need the water, so you need a drop in water. That's where you get the energy from. It's potential energy drop. So that's really important. And hydro energy also has another benefit as a form of storage. If you've got a way of pumping water uphill when you don't need the electricity, and then run it downhill when you do. So mountainous countries tend to be best for that, but you can build various kind of storage facilities that are high, like water towers, that you could use those for electricity, not just for the water pressure that you need in an area. So there is hydro, but I'm thinking more on the community side, regardless of whether it's hydro or solar. So you can build community infrastructure. I was really interested in Joshua's points about how if we get people defecting, because a lot of people who really care about the environment are thinking of doing that. And the cost of infrastructure to other people be terrible. So there are schemes emerging, and we can really learn from them in various different countries. I think you're going to go onto microgrids, and I've actually found out about one yesterday that's interesting. So we'll go on to that later. Yeah, bring me back to this question. Go on, Francesco, what do you want me to answer?
No, I mean, the thing is related to, how can I say, the availability. I mean, water is not so evenly distributed, let's say, right?
No.
Yeah, so that is the point. I mean, what can we develop, or what can we use as an alternative?
Yeah, so you've got to use what you have locally, and within the system you have locally. And the addition to that is storage. I think storage is going to be the really big issue, because with renewables, you have them weather dependent, or with hydro, you have it water flow dependent, which vaguely relates to the seasons. So you need to have improved storage if you want to rely on renewables. And people always think of storage as being batteries. And yes, that's improving. And you can do that on a microgrid level as well. And some people are starting to do big grid. But you can store the energy thermally and then release that later. So people do it in big oil tanks. I don't necessarily mean oil as in fossil fuel oil. It could be vegetable oil. But it's very good for its heat capacity. And so we'll need more of that. So, and people's electric cars, if they could charge both ways, they can be used as storage as well. So you plug them in at night, they fill up with electricity, but maybe during the day you're not using it either, so it supplies electricity to the grid. That would be a really good way to balance networks in developed countries. I'm not quite sure how useful it is generally worldwide.
Okay, thank you. Emilio, you had...
Yeah, so I would begin with a personal take, because just yesterday I was without electricity for part of the morning during my only call in the day, and I was actually worried about today. And I started thinking, oh no, they're mining crypto again, because that is. I feel that there's some relation between the time when our country started mining and the lack of electricity, or the intermittent service. And yeah, and it just made me reminisce of I grew up at the end of a civil war, and the electricity grid had lots of disruptions when I was a kid, and that was the normal, at 6 p.m. Oh no, we don't have electricity. So I feel that when we think about a future without sources of energy, it's basically the state of many communities around the world right now who are not in developed countries, have electricity or energy in general at certain times, but not all the time. And yeah, it is. I mean, right now it is considered a form of poverty, right? Not having access to these types of energy in general. And probably that is where we're headed, in the case that we don't shift into renewable but also accessible energy. And then the second thing that comes to mind is the fact that in some ways we are living the lack of these resources through artificial scarcity, either by trade wars or war. So there are some situations right now where we are living in the future where there's no access to fossil fuels. So those are spaces where we have to start thinking about what are the feasible solutions for these communities in ways that are, that the production of and the logistics for solar panels works, or the transferring and storage of energy, etc. So there's lots of questions about logistics, as Sophie mentioned, that we have to sort out.
But do you think that the scarcity is artificially driven?
I mean, by the market. That is what I mean. Yeah, it's not. Yeah, I'm not saying that there is. Just playing with the with it, but just that it's not happening. It's man-made, human-made.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, but we know that the perfect market doesn't exist. I mean, that's an invention of economists. The market is driven by powerful people or powerful corporations that tend to exercise that power onto the others. So
Yeah.
my question is, would, for example, an unregulated or an more independent or run by the people sort of architecture lower the cost of energy?
Yeah, definitely. Yes. Yes. Yeah, there's always the cost of logistics on top of everything that's being supplied, right? So if you put it in terms of the electricity, that is one big problem. Here in El Salvador, for example, we do not have a community-led uh, energy, but there is, for example, lots of work with water, and that drives the costs down, and it gives empowerment to communities in general to just to do whatever they want with the resources in a way that's sustainable.
Joshua, you want to add something to that? So you were nodding.
All right. Well, your question about would it reduce the costs, and there's absolutely no question that it would. I mean, already you can run the economics on especially solar at the nanoscale, like for your house or for a specific appliance. And I don't care what country you're talking about, you'll beat the grid if you're getting access to reasonable supplies. And if you go one step further and do some of the work yourself, and this is where there's maybe a small difference between the developed and developing countries. The developing countries can produce solar electricity way less expensively than we can in the States, simply by using their own labor. And so you can always trade a little bit of your labor in to cut the cost in half. And that same principle applies even in places like the US and Europe. And so when the technologies are finally here where people could do a lot of the work themselves, and the instructions on how to do that are posted on Appropedia, like it's finally ready. And that wasn't always the case, and we don't have everything. So for example, photovoltaics, the electronics, the balance of systems, that's all freely available. Everybody can copy it. And there are plans to, say, produce a panel by yourself, but honestly, we're not quite ready. We can't compete economically with scale on that, but many other technologies we can. And that's changing on a daily basis. Like, we keep marching forward, and it's kind of nice. And Emilio in the background, you can see he's got a 3D printer, which I guarantee, I don't know which one it is, but it was evolved from an open source 3D printing plans. And so 20 years ago, additive manufacturing wasn't possible, and now it's accessible to the vast majority of the world's population.
Yeah, that's very cool. I mean, I used to work in IBM, and I remember the old saying that went like, "Oh, there will never be a personal computer in the house, in the house of people, and we have this beautiful mainframe, and we will run the system." So I'm imagining the same for 3D printers and photovoltaics. I'm waiting for the moment, but I'm happy to see that the curve is going down, and these technologies are spreading throughout the world, throughout the communities, lowering the cost of access and making information and knowledge available to as many people as possible. So that brings me to the next question, which is like, imagining what would be the most promising non-fossil fuel energy, or even a mix of renewable resources considering different regions and scales, given the current state of development, and why would you bet on it to empower future communities? So now I would like to start from Sophie.
Well, much as a lot of environmentalists don't like nuclear, it's the obvious one for creating a lot of energy using existing infrastructure in a single place. Great, lovely, lovely, lovely. And it's actually kills many fewer people than fossil fuel energy does. But the problem is, you start thinking about building a nuclear plant in 30 years' time. You might, if you're lucky, have it commissioned. And meanwhile, we've been using fossil fuels and all that, because you want the carbon dioxide graph to go down really quickly, because if it goes down slowly, it's the area under the graph, under that line, which is the amount of carbon that's gone into the atmosphere. So if you go down quickly, you've reduced renewable energy or, non-fossil fuel energy, non-carbon energy really quickly, then you're not sticking, 20 years, 30 years of carbon into the atmosphere. But if you're waiting 30 years, you're completely done for. So that option is kind of out of the window, even if you can argue for it. And long term, maybe it is something you can argue for. But short term, we've really got to go for renewables. But I would also like to go for resilience for lack of electricity. Situations are going to get much more common, like Emilio's, where you get times of the day where you don't have electricity, or several days where you don't. And then as we currently live, when you look back at the technology discussions that we had before this, the previous panel, it was all about things that relied on electricity. That was the secret Achilles heel on everything they were talking about. Even if it was the things that day to day you rely on, as basic as SMS or, cooking or turning the lights on. And so we need to work out ways to be resilient around those. And that will be community focused and less reliant on the things that could just suddenly let us down. But I like the library's idea as well, because information we need to start thinking about. We can't rely on it always being electronic. I love the idea of Appropedia. I haven't come across it before. I love it that it's shared, but I really hope you've got a hard copy of it. So, that's kind of my take on that side. But yeah, use the energy you have and that your community can harness within the constraints you have locally. It's fun to do, and you build a really good sense of community if you create something real.
All right. Thank you. Emilio, what would you bet on?
So let me begin by saying I don't
Sure.
think I'm super qualified to answer this question, but
Okay.
I can say that so when we're starting with the standpoint that we're thinking of smaller communities, right? So that was what came from the first question. And I think it's important to start thinking about the conflicts that arise at a community level when you have, even if they're renewable resources, they're finite in the sense that you only have certain amount. And so that brings us to a bigger problem, which is that the rate at which we consume electricity is as important as the type of electricity or energy that we so if we want to produce renewable energy to power our future, but we are still under the same patterns of consumption and the same rates of consumption, it will never be enough. And especially if we're thinking of expanding how much energy we use. So that is one important thing, because for example, I really like hydroelectrical energy, but there's a big problem with climate change and the lack of water in rivers, or what construction does to the water sources, etc. So I see that here with the river starting to be badly damaged, and problems with borders with other countries that are affecting how we produce electricity. So there will always be systemic problems that go outside of that. And then I definitely think that we have to aim for personal agency, or the smallest. So I really like solar, as Joshua mentioned, for that reason, because you can have your own system, right? So yeah. But then again, if you are consuming too much, then it doesn't make sense anyway. So yeah, that's
Yeah, That's a tricky element, of course. Yeah, maybe reducing the consumption is also related to how much the devices consume or making them more efficient. So technology could play a role in that. You know, to power a house, we needed. This goes into probably more even technical elements. Joshua, yes, please
Yes. So
tell
I
us.
unquestionably am a mass proponent of solar energy, specifically photovoltaics. If you look at the energy use that we need, it comes in three forms: electricity, heat, and transportation. Since about 2011, the levelized cost of electricity coming from solar in most of the world's grids had already crossed the threshold where it was equivalent or less costly than the grid. Today, it's almost certainly less costly, and it's just a matter of how the rate structure is set up by your local utility on exactly how much profit you'd make. When we look at heat, that's a little bit more challenging. And just this last year in North America, in both Canada and the US, you can heat your home with an air source heat pump powered by photovoltaics, and it is overall less costly. So then you're providing all of your electricity and your heat. And it's just at the margin, like you're maybe making 1 or 2% return on it. And what's happening is the lower cost solar electricity is actually subsidizing your heating. But it's there. We're finally there. And so, we're starting to see heat pumps all over the place. Like Europe's kind of a little bit ahead of really everywhere everywhere in the world right now in going there. And then in electric vehicles, when you look at a new car and an equivalent electric vehicle and the total cost of ownership over its lifetime, it's already there. It's already economic. And so but going to Emilio's point about how much we're actually using, you can have a very small electric vehicle and it still gets you from point A to point B, and that makes a lot more sense than a giant, SUV that happens to have a big battery in it. And maybe it makes even more sense to move closer to where you work or where you go to school and either walk or ride a bicycle. And then your energy use for transport goes out the window. So I think really everybody on the globe has the opportunity to use photovoltaics to drive the amount of energy that they need. And if you're in the developed world and you're in a northern climate and you have substantial heating needs, heat pumps are finally there for you, both for water heating and for heating your home or business. Electricity is available everywhere, and transport is a little bit trickier, but there's things like electric bikes. You don't have to go all the way to buying a Tesla. You can get to something that's a little bit more approachable. And if you're in a developing context where there's intermittent electricity, most of it's coming, maybe you're at a kind of far from the grid, so you're using diesel. Again, solar beats diesel basically everywhere from northern Canada to the equator. And so we're at this point, but it's going much slower, as Sophie pointed out, than we need it to happen. Way back when I got my PhD, we made solar cells cheaper than glass, and I was like, we're done, like just freaking put them up. And it's kind of sad how long it's taken. And even now, where it's definitely profitable, you still have both the regulatory and the government getting in the way, largely because they're being manipulated by people that are profiting from the status quo, and just normal everyday people being like, I don't want to do that, it's too complicated, I don't want to put up the costs even though I would make money. It's like, well, if we're going to believe in kind of economics, it says you should get the least cost thing. And if actually everyone was economically rational, we wouldn't have to have this conversation. It would be done already. But we're still, we've got a really, really long way to go, and it's got to happen fairly fast. And everything is promising in that, the two fastest growing sources of energy are wind and solar. But wind, you can only go so far because it's very location dependent. Solar can go everywhere, but it's got to scale up so much. I mean, we're only a couple % of the total energy generation for the world. And then going back to hydro, so solar makes a lot of sense at the small scale, and it can go really to any scale. But it really suffers from lack of, let's say, affordable storage. And hydro is amazing at affordable storage, but it sort of demands a larger scale, like having a dam in your backyard for the little creek that runs through it. Like, not a lot of people have that option, but they would have the option, once you just expand geographically a little bit. There's a lot of lakes, like even in Michigan, they were doing pump storage, and we're not particularly known for being hilly or mountainous, and it makes economic sense now. And when you couple pumped hydro, a little bit of electric storage, and put the basket of renewable energy technologies together, everywhere in the world can be run on renewable energy now. And in Germany, they've demonstrated it at a very large scale, but there's a bunch of smaller scale, like microgrid type technologies that are already ready, already available, already commercialized. It just has to actually get done.
Oh, thank you. That was really interesting. I've just imagined some futures as a science fiction writer. From one side, these large-scale geoengineering projects, like putting photovoltaics in the stratosphere, or maybe assembling solar farms, solar towers in the desert, where the sun hits, every day very hard. On another side, on another level, for example, I know people that crowdfunded a huge wind turbine in Italy to kind of produce energy for a village, and maybe like 30,000 people. So is there some kind of, where are we going? Are we going to the big geoengineering, and who runs them? Because Solarpunk doesn't want, of course, to have a centralized production, or are we going to a crowdfunding microgrid kind of futures? What do you think? Who wants to answer? Just please do.
Yeah, I was actually also thinking, like, putting on the back of my head, what does this mean for the future? And I think that from the discussion now, I see like two contradicting positions. One is that we need to basically live a more individualized life, because the grid is evil, and there's lots of people who. So, for example, if we put solar panels in space, or etc., I would produce all this energy. There will always be an industry that will find a way to spend it all. So that is, I think, the big problem with those solutions that take technology solely into account, because there's a big problem in how we consume and how companies and corporations consume, and yeah, I mean, that is the big issue, and we even see it to a smaller scale. We see it with natural resources at a city level or a town level, where there are people who might want to take over the resources. So as long as we think of a way of solving that conundrum, we will have technology makes sense for the type of solutions and features that we want. And then there's the other side. So the first one is, we have to be individualized, because it's better to set up my own solar panel and do my own thing and to produce my own energy. But then there's the other side, that solar panels, I cannot produce them. There's always we're always connected to industry, to manufacturing, and solar panels also have a carbon footprint, and they also are toxic to the environment, etc., if they're not properly disposed of. So we're still connected to society, and we still have to find ways to deal with how we consume as a society, right? So unless we start thinking, such as people in the 70s who were like, let's just make a commune in no person's land, and just build our own solar panels, and et cetera, I think we still have lots of things to solve.
Anybody wants to add?
Yeah, I think one of the, so I've got to go back to Emilio's carbon footprint comment, but I'll get to that in a second. But the thing that's broken now is that we use economics to make our decisions, and the economics that we're using aren't complete. And a really good example of this is when you compare large-scale solar farms to rooftop solar in your own community. And if you look at it from conventional economics, it says you have big scale, you've got workers doing the same thing for days on end. You put concrete on the ground, put up some metal racks, and throw your solar panels on them, and you can make less costly solar electricity that way. But then when you actually look at the carbon footprint of the two, and you have a roof structure that's already there, the structure's already there, you're basically just mounting some rails to it and slapping the solar panels on, it's much less carbon intensive. It uses much less energy, much less materials. There's no reason it should actually cost more. And when you dig down into the numbers, what's going on is that the regulatory framework forces you to pay a certain amount just to put up a single solar system. And when you're putting up a giant one, yeah, they got to do an environmental impact statement, but it's puny compared to the millions of dollars that are going into the system. Where when you're talking about a little individual home, that might be a substantial fraction of the entire cost of the system. And so you end up with this completely distorted economic framework, and that has to get fixed. And it's different literally for every country, but even different municipalities and different, depending on who your utility is, set those roles. And some utilities are very pro distributed generation, having solar in everybody's houses. They're even funding people to put batteries in to be more resilient. And then some utilities are the exact opposite, where they're trying to minimize distributed generation. They want giant solar farms that they can put a fence around and own and profit from their customers the same way they're doing now. And that it is possible to have both. There are, I would say, future seen utilities that are renting the roof space of their customers to put solar panels on it, to provide it, because it's technically superior. When you actually have distributed generation where you're actually using it, you need less infrastructure for transmission. It costs less overall, but that is something that our economic system is not there yet. And especially once you start to throw kind of carbon into the mix, we don't value it in most of the economies today. We certainly don't value it versus the overall risk that it has. So if I am creating a more carbon intensive energy source, no matter what it is, if it's something pathetic like coal, and what I'm doing to, say, someone in Florida is increasing their cost of their flood insurance, or maybe making it so they can't even get flood insurance anymore. And that has not been brought into the overall economy. So we're not actually making rational decisions. So that's the fundamental piece that needs fixed. And I think, Francesco, you really, hit the nail on the head. This is the war right now. Are we going to, possibly we could live in two different solar societies. One where there's a giant big solar farm that's sitting in Nevada that's powering the whole world, and one that is everybody has their own solar and they live in these nice little communities. They're all super resilient, and it's like a federation of microgrids. Or are we all going to be paying, one person for the privilege of being able to turn on the lights in the morning? And I don't know which way we're going, right? There's promising paths, and both potentials are, both futures are potential right now.
Yeah, but in a way, if these two huge moment of discontinuity represented by the coronavirus and the war haven't really created the big, hunger or convincement to do it right here and right now, what else do we need? Maybe we need it from the bottom up, not waiting for a top-down solution, which probably will never come. That is a political question, of course. But probably the people are also, that have their hands in they have their words to say about what kind of future they want, if this answer is not coming from the political side. What do you think?
I think we need to opt out in order to show what can be done. So to opt out from big government schemes. One that I came across yesterday that I started mentioning earlier is in Bangladesh. It's called SolShare. And it's a scheme where people, just individuals who live in little shacks with solar panels on the top, can sell their electricity to their neighbors just by putting in a box that checks off how much electricity they're generating, and who they're selling it to, and how much those people are using. And it's a community funded project. And it's quite interesting because the areas in which it succeeds, because people are kind of getting on with it, but the areas which it's succeeding are areas where there isn't corruption, because they're getting problems in areas of Bangladesh where there are corrupt officials who just stop people doing it. But in areas where they can just get on with it, they're proving that it really works. And it means that the people who can't afford even a solar panel on their roof are getting electricity to charge their phones so they can communicate with their family wherever, and so they can have lights over, and so that they can have village street lighting so they're safer at night, and so their kids can do their homework and all that kind of thing. And that side, it would be good to have lots of examples of in all different national backgrounds. So, you know, countries where they are getting microgrids right and heating networks right. It'd be very good to learn from and try and replicate in as much as your local government lets you. But yeah, I note Joshua's word of caution about going off-grid, even as a community, to try and keep within the grid, but be more reliant on your own electricity. And he also mentioned about locally produced electricity. One thing he didn't mention in the economics, which I'm sure you know about, is losses in the network. Communicating electricity all around the country, you give 30% or more losses of electricity that's been hard won. You want to use it locally so you don't get those losses.
Can you share something about that project, SolShare, you said, in Bangladesh?
Yeah, I will share
Okay.
the web page. Just
Yes. That's really interesting, and that's the power of our grid.
yeah, can you, sorry, just a minute, SolShare. Can you see it?
You can write it here in the...
Okay, just a minute. I will.
Yeah. Don't worry.
I was actually sharing the page on the video, but maybe...
Whatever you can get, that will be useful.
Right. Share. Let's see. Can you see yourselves? Yeah, this one? SolShare? Can you see that?
Okay. SolShares. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Excellent. Oh, yeah. SolShares.com. Yeah. Thank you very much indeed.
It's me-solshare.com. Interestingly. Yeah. But anyway, we will go back. I will unshare.
Okay.
Or have you unshared me? Stop sharing. There we go.
Emilio, you want to add something to this?
Yeah, I was just like, there are so many angles to bring in, but I came across a project. I think it was from a company in Central America that was specifically about locally produced solar energy, but it charges the amount of energy that people use. So it's not that you buy the system, but rather they give you the system. They lend you, I think, the system, and you produce the solar energy, but you pay the amount that you use. So it was weird because, yeah, even though we can say that locally produced energy is good, there's always a way for capitalism to create scarcity, right? And in this case, it's that there is added value, like there's an added cost for as many kilowatts that you use. So yeah, I think the problem is how we view energy and how we spend it, right? And how we profit from it. So there are so many angles about the way that it's being run in general. So I think it's important to think about how people have access to systems that they can produce, that they can reproduce, etc. And then one other comment that I wanted to bring out that fits, I think, well with your question, your previous question, was that I've been reading a lot about the middle out approach, which is you have top down, which is policies, regulations, etc. And then you have bottom up, which is community-led production, etc. But there's this middle out approach, which is by technical experts, decision makers who are deciding which technology to use, how to cut costs, etc. in organizations, etc. And that is an interesting approach because people with the know-how, with the technical knowledge, are the ones who can drive some of the decisions made either by the top crowd who ask them, what do you think about using this technology? And, which one should we choose? What's the type of efficiency that we should aim for? And then also influence people to build their own systems, to manage their own energy, etc. So I think it's important that we band together and bring in the experts in energy and in technology to tackle all of this.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. We're receiving some comments that probably we are trying to save capitalism. We're trying to just amend some of these original sins, but some people are really kind of advocating a radical change into the way the operating system of our present is working.
That's what we need.
Yeah, I just want to reassure the audience that we're not here to kind of reassure the framework. We're trying to understand how we can not make a revolution but an evolution, because revolutions are never really for the people. They are for another group of privilege that substitute the previous one, for my personal opinion. This is my personal take. So let's say my next question is about this concept: maintaining the past, adapt the present, transform the future. How can a community decide what power source to use? Is there any optimum solution or a framework or list of priorities to consider? Is it enough to trust a city grid, or should they develop district buildings, microgrids? That's what has been mentioned before. Anybody wants to add or comment on this?
I can start a little bit. So, assuming that we're still stuck in our current economic framework without anything radically changing, if you're trying to make a decision on what renewable energy source makes the most sense for your area, hopefully you already have a general feel. Like if you happen to live next to a giant river with a big waterfall, you might want to immediately think about hydro. If there's heavy winds in your area, wind farm might make sense. And if you pretty much live anywhere where humans do, solar probably is at least a beginning option. But the National Renewable Energy Lab in the US publishes an open source, it's like a system advisory model. And so you can take the costs of a whole range of different renewable energy technologies, biomass, wind, solar, hydro, storage, all different kinds of things, and put them in this model and compare them. And this is not an easy to use thing that you can just pick up in 5 minutes, but anyone that I would say is university educated, that understands basic economics, can walk through this and get a good solution. And they might have to do that for their community, but then you can be going after what's at least economically most rational today. And the good news on that is that it is almost always renewable energy. So you'll be kind of tilting towards the right direction.
Anybody wants to add something to this?
I kind of see it the other way around. I think we can use community energy to break the system, especially with solar, because it is now possible to have community and ownership, local ownership of electricity. It will make the power companies weaker, and it will make the state weaker. And they might not like this, but it changes things. If you give the power to people in their hands, it makes them more powerful. It gives them a bigger say. And we do need to, if we carry on with our current economic system, where we use as much electricity we do, say in the UK, we're already way outside what's sustainable. We're over 3 times more electricity used here than we should be using if we wanted to keep sustainable. So we've got to really change how we are. We can't stick with capitalism. We've got to think how we're going to do things differently in a much more pandemic style way of thinking. Something big has happened. We've got to change. How are we going to survive? And it's about us all surviving well. Because to be honest, even the big guys depend on everybody else. So they can't kill us off. And the more of us they kill off, the more they need us. Because like in the plague, The major thing that got rid of feudalism in the UK and the rest of Europe was when the plague came along. It killed so many workers that suddenly they had to start paying the workers, otherwise they just wouldn't work for you. They'd work for themselves. And so it'll make it, they'll have to be even more dependent on us if they keep killing us off. So, you know, it's
have you heard
happen the hard way or the easy way, and I'd much prefer it happen the easy way, where we all think about it and in a communal and kind way, that this economics sucks and we've got to listen to, we don't want to be listening to 18th century economic theory. We want to think much more about donut economics, was mentioned in the last panel, where you keep within your environmental ceiling and you try and get everybody above the social foundation so that everybody's living somewhere comfortable, and that you value households and local communities easily as much as you value sort of money systems. You know, what do you really, really value in life? You value your family, you value your friends, you value the people who can support you around you, and you value people with practical skills who can really get on and do stuff. You know, so
have you heard about the big resignation of the last 2 years? This movement of people, you know, leaving their jobs, not accepting anymore the present as a continuous future, or a continuous present, actually. So there is hundreds of people, hundreds of thousands of people that are leaving their jobs. I heard that is getting bigger and bigger. And personally, I have written a science fiction novel about these people creating artificial photosynthesis on their skin and just leaving the city and start to repopulate abandoned places that were left due to the urbanization of the 18th and 19th century. So there are big some let's say weak signals which are getting louder and louder about a big resignation from the current state of our operating system. Let's say cities probably are not the most sustainable or more livable, more pleasant place to live. We see already huge movement of counter-urbanization, especially in the developing countries. But of course, there is probably 1.5 billion people that want to move into the city from the developing countries. So how do we manage this transition? It's really, really outstanding. It's really huge, massive. It's complicated.
Can I?
And please, yes.
Yeah. I wanted to mention that I do think I know the question was very focused on how to consider what kind of energy, how to install it. But I think we're talking about power relations, right? And we're talking about justice. And I think it's important to think that when we're talking about transition, we have to talk about these power structures and how to break them, right? And I really love, for example, for the past couple of years, I've been reading a lot of the writings about technology and society from these guys from the 70s. And I think they still resonate, that they're still talking about problems that we have and they haven't been solved. And one that I read recently was people from Latin America. So I think it's related to Ivan Illich's work in Mexico and this movement connected to the theology, liberation theology. But one thing that these writers were mentioning is the need for technology to work based on what people need, like the human needs, and which connects to what Sophie's saying, right? So what's important in life. So it's more about the transition is more about an existential thing than about technology, because otherwise we're going to start considering that technology's means to an end. For example, this whole view overtaken by cryptocurrencies and blockchain, etc., which says, just technology is going to continue developing. There's nothing we can do to stop progress, etc. So there's a worldview in which technology will never stop, and we just have to jump on the bandwagon. Otherwise, we're going to be left behind. And it's not true. We have to start considering a more critical approach to how we see technology, right? So so that is one thing, and I think it's important to think about what Paulo Freire talked about, creating consciousness awareness, which is just the dialectical process of talking to people, creating awareness, and thinking about, this is what you need in your life. This is the consumption that's important for you, right? This is, etc. And then based on that, thinking about how to transition. Because even if maybe it's a little too late for that, but even in the process that we are right now, depending on fossil fuels, etc., if we're conscious about how we spend energy and fossil fuels, we can get better, right? So that's the whole thing about reducing the carbon footprint and below 1.5 degrees, etc. That's the whole approach, which is basically reducing the growth, etc. So there's a whole approach in there. But then if we transition to better energy sources, then we're it's more possible, right? But that requires community-based approaches, etc. So yeah.
Well, that brings me to a kind of idea. I mean, I think that the whole discussion now should go into the role of energy literacy and education, because in a way we have experienced very high level of consumption, but many people in the developing countries never did. So who are we to deprive them from this wonderful experience? So how do we kind of teach, or how can they learn that maybe this way of living isn't the best, because they want to have what we had for a very long time. Some I'm not saying centuries, but I'm saying some very long time. So the issue that I'm raising is literacy and education in terms of energy, and where does the individual choice ends and a community choice begins? What do you know about any kind of project in that regard? I mean, teaching people or educating people in literacy, energy. Are you part of it, or do you have any knowledge to share with us? Anybody? Yep.
Yeah, I'm actually working on one as part of my fellowship for the Green Web Foundation. It's on Appropedia, and it's so the whole framework around it is based on the idea that there's in the regarding the carbon footprint of the internet and digital services, lots of these companies are outsourcing their carbon footprint to workers in the developing countries, right? So I have lots of friends here in El Salvador, or I know people in Argentina and other places in Latin America, but I know that in Asia, etc., things are happening the same way, where they go to platforms like Upwork, they get hired to do coding, graphic design for internet companies. So there's this big carbon footprint that's being just outsourced, and the companies are just reducing them from their reports. And so that's one. And then the second thing is that people in developing countries are the ones who are suffering from climate change the most.
Yes.
We get natural disasters, resource extraction, etc. And that goes from mining for lithium, or water usage for data centers, etc. So So the approach that I wanted to take for this, it's a small syllabus. It's basically to create awareness as a tech developer or an internet practitioner into the systemic view of things. You're just an ant in a, what's the idiom? An ant in the storm or something like that? I forget, but yeah. But an ant in a hurricane, let's just say, and you don't have the agency because you're a contractor. So it's very difficult for you to start thinking about that organization as your organization. But I tried to take that approach into taking first the personal footprint, evaluating how you see yourself, how much you're producing, and saying, this is what the organization is producing through you. Then multiply this by the number of tech workers who are being outsourced. Then the second part is evaluate the role of the company that you're working for in the industry. And I've shamelessly stolen an inventory from a colleague called Jean Mulro, and he worked on an inventory for basically cyber physical systems to evaluate how organizations produce their footprint in different ways by electronics, non-electronics, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, to think about what is happening around you. What kinds of climate injustices are happening to you, for example, in terms of mining or water, resource extraction, et cetera. So trying to create this systemic approach and then circling back to you. You're being affected by this and you're doing this. So what can you do? What kinds of decisions you can be empowered to make this, create changes in enacting, for example, bringing in pressure for organizations to adopt policies for environmental actions, etc. So I'll share it. It's not yet completely finished, but I will share it to you because I do want some feedback. So I will appreciate it.
Thank you. Anybody on energy literacy and education?
Sure, absolutely. So I think especially with the kind of the focus of this conference being at least in part on science fiction, I think there's really something to be said for having stories out in the public that show a better future and maybe a path towards it that are interesting enough to engage people. I can't say enough how important that's been sort of like for my own decision making about on what to research and what to push forward on. And so I think, we owe a lot to the science fiction writers that have gotten us some of the really nice technologies that we have today because you've inspired engineers and scientists to work on it. And I think we need more of that moving us into the future because a large fraction of the population just can't imagine a future of, say, distributed solar. And to give you a feel for that, I want to share with you a review from one of my recent papers that I'm working on right now. We made a open source wood-based photovoltaic rack. And so right now, when you look at small scale solar, the most expensive part is not the solar panel, which is what has been for the last 50 years, that was always the case. Now it's the rack. And so and it's just aluminum extruded rails. There's nothing fancy about it at all, but they're all patented and they're these fantastic wizardry things, but it's totally unnecessary. One of the companies, tries to advertise it by driving a pickup truck over it, but you don't have to drive a pickup truck over your solar panels. You don't need that kind of mechanical strength. And so we did a design where we based it on wood and it worked out pretty good. And so then we said, well, maybe we'll go to the next step and see if we can have it change the angle. And again, if you're the person changing the angle on your solar panels, you're not charging yourself for the labor, and it actually turns out to make economic sense. So anyway, we wrote this paper. It makes huge economic sense, at least in North America. And one of the reviewers was like, well, this can't scale. And you need to talk about why this is completely unscalable. And I'm like, what are you talking about? It was a 1 kilowatt demonstration system. It can scale laterally. If all of your neighbors have a 1 kilowatt system, you've just made hundreds of megawatts. It completely scales. And what the problem the reviewer was having is just envisioning a future where things do laterally scale, where when we share an open source design, say on Appropedia, I maybe only make it for my own family or my own community, but it could replicate tens of thousands, millions of times. And that's the kind of the hallmark of open source design and this kind of actually creating things locally. Like that exists now. It definitely works. And with digital technologies, we can push it to, not just a couple products, we can push it to millions of products. So it's all sitting right here. Like we can live the science fiction life if we want to, but people just have to be made aware of it. And I think, honestly, that is going to come in part from good storytelling. Is that, seeing movies, seeing television shows, seeing reading books and comic books that are engaging enough to make people think that we maybe could have this better future.
Thank you. I think it's time that we move for some questions from the audience. So
There's some great ones.
Yeah, we have a lot of them. So I'm sorry, we don't have time to pick them all, but I will just choose to highlight some of them to you. For example, this one. The notions of community and individual ownership and production of energy. Can you describe how that looks in urban contexts? Anybody?
That's a great question, and one of the biggest challenges for solar. The way the grid operates and economics operates now, if you're living in, say, an apartment building, you're mostly screwed depending on where you are in the world. Some places in Europe allow plug-and-play solar, where you can have a microinverter attached directly to a panel that you could hang on your balcony and plug literally into your wall to start eating up your load. But in many other countries, the US as a good example, most of the US, that's not legal. Some places like Texas allow it. And most of the microinverter companies only sell 220 volt microinverters. So you can't even plug it in if you want to. So I think part of that is technology. It's on people like me to actually build open source microinverters, and that's a project one of my PhD students is working on right now. But next, we need it to be legal to be able to do that. And with that potential, we at least can bring many apartment renters into the overall fold. The truth, though, is that to power, say, the densest cities like the Luxembourgs of the world, we don't actually have enough roof area to cover all their load, especially once we start talking about thermal energy and transportation. And in that case, we need to start using some of the rural areas. And to do that, in my opinion, the best technology we have now is agrivoltaics, where you combine agriculture and solar. So you're partially shading the crops that protects them from overheating. It allows you to use less water, and you still get the solar electricity from it. And so you get, in some cases, higher yields in your actual food crop, and you get the solar electricity and the water savings. And so this is taking root. Europe's ahead. Both Korea and Japan have done a bunch of demonstration projects that have been commercialized. And in the Americas, not as much, but we're getting there. That's one of these technologies that I think falls very much in the narrative of kind of the Solarpunk genre that just needs to be deployed. The economics are already there. You can't convince a farmer that it doesn't make sense when, whatever they're growing, say peppers, they get more peppers and they're making far more in electricity sales than they would from ever selling peppers. So we just need to get the technology deployed.
Anybody else on this, or I move to another question?
Well, it kind of links in to the question that's about private ownership rather than renting, because a lot of our answers are relying on people having ownership over their land and their roof space and that side of things. And in most of the world, the land was taken from the community ownership, because it always starts off in community ownership, and then it was taken hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And so that's a really difficult subject. And I would really like to know the answer on that one, because it doesn't seem fair. For example, I've been to the Scilly Isles, which is off the south coast of the UK, and it's a really sunny, lovely place. No solar panels on any of the buildings. They're all owned by Prince Charles, and he rents them out, and he doesn't want the buildings to look ugly with solar panels. So you got real problems like that. So how do we get around that?
All right. There's another question. How do we mobilize enough people to exact the level of change needed to force energy giants to transition away from fossil fuels and invest in renewable energy. That's also, anybody wants to add, comment on this?
That is the $1 million question, I think. Yeah, I've heard from different people different approaches. I think one important is to have, what do you call it, a critical mass? Yeah, a critical mass of people who are shifting towards renewables, different patterns of consumption, and I think that ties in well with the previous question about literacy, because I think it's important to create the critical thinking in societies, in our communities, which is necessary to question, why are we using this type of energy? Why are we not using solar energy? Why are we so all these questions and the influence, especially in terms of types of technologies being accepted, types of things that are being so, and I think it has to go beyond the measure your own footprint or see how much you spend and creating guilt in people about their position and what they do, right? It's more about thinking more systemically. You're part of this big system that's producing energy and delivering it in a way that's not sustainable, efficient, it's expensive, etc. And then try to move towards a different approach. So I think information awareness is the first part in a way that's critical, and then finding ways for action, right? And the biggest way to shift opinions is by using our resources, our money, right? If a company does not become successful, then that's a good way to shift the bottle towards different ways of doing things.
Thank you. Anybody else wants to comment on this?
I think we just need everybody to do their little part, and with a little bit of effort, you can think of it almost like tithing. Spend 10% of your time trying to change the whole system. That's actually a huge amount of time, and you can actually get a lot done. So just as an example, corporate social responsibility. There's social responsible investing now, where you might have not a ton of money, but you probably have at least a little bit of savings, and maybe you have a retirement plan. And if you have that money, you can dictate what it's invested upon. And it's very easy to go into an investment that is not, say, ExxonMobil or not a major energy company that's currently using fossil fuels. And let's say you have no money, or like your total assets don't make any sense. You can band together with other people through the institution that you're part of. So for example, if you're a student, you can get the endowment funds that are currently probably invested randomly, which means a large fraction of it actually is funding the fossil fuel industry, and force them to defund, de-invest from those companies. And they don't necessarily have to go into solar and wind companies. They could go into like shoe manufacturing. It doesn't matter. You just need to keep extracting, making capital more expensive for the fossil fuel companies so that they eventually fold. And if we look at what happened to the coal companies in the US, coal is not economic anymore. It makes no economic sense. No bank should be lending them any kind of money, and they're going bankrupt. And so we just take them down one at a time. So coal's already, they're on their knees. Next is natural gas and oil. We need to go after those companies and force them to move over. And the ones that are looking to the future, they already know this. They're already investing in giant wind farms and solar panel plants and that kind of thing, or battery plants. We just need to nudge them in that direction more quickly. And the way to do it right now in our system is economics.
Yeah. I'm not sure on that one. I don't think it's going to work fast enough to do the economic side. And also, it doesn't change our consumption levels. We need to radically reduce our consumption levels. So although these are all good things, and I wouldn't say don't do them, we need much more change, and we need people's minds changed. Going back to the educational point, the public campaigning, people willing to put their freedom on the line to campaign for environmental justice is really, really important. And people take the piss out of that, but it's the main thing that changes individuals' views and governmental views and everybody's views, and makes them think, well, maybe there's a different way of doing it. I mean, I love being part of Scientist Rebellion. I've only just joined it. I recommend anybody joining Scientist Rebellion. It's a worldwide international organization, both spreading the science of climate change, but also there's a new group within it setting up, a new group setting up all the time on polycentricity, which is changing, so Scientist Rebellion Polycentricity, which is changing the way people think and going back to lots and lots of centers, all being much more self-sustainable in the kind of transition towns ethos of being locally reliant. But going back to the educational point, if we get out on the streets and in nonviolent direct action, we make ourselves heard and we change people's minds, that is going to make a real difference, especially when we use facts, when there's a lot of anti-facts out there. If we really stick to the facts like Science Rebellion does, I find it really empowering that just a small number of people can get the facts out there when our media is trying to cover them up because, well, I don't know about in your countries, but in ours, the 4 major media tycoons are all it's climate change deniers. So we're kind of screwed. So we have to get the information out there some other way.
Okay, which leads me to another question, which is this: where is the punk in this, in your opinion? So yes, we covered the solar, but no, we also covered the punk, but this specifically asks for some, a strategy or tactics, as Extinction Rebellion sometimes advocates. I remember a beautiful graffiti by Banksy that says, "This is where despair ends and tactic begins." That is kind of I think slogan for Solarpunk. We should stop despairing and start using some tactics in a very guerrilla gardening style. I don't know. You want to add something to this?
Yeah, I think 2 things come to mind. The first one is the DIY ethics, right? I think it's important to, and maybe because I've been reading so much about the internet's energy footprint and everything, but I think we have to go back to materiality. Like we have to put our feet on the ground, on the soil, and think about the impacts of the actions. Because I see that from the punk philosophy to be very material, to consider the world around you, and maybe that's what makes punk so bleak sometimes, right? Because you just get in contact with the real world, and then you go like, oh. So this is what's happening. But I think it's important. And then the second one, I think it's open source. I think I got moved into open source by reading punk cassettes. The pages that come with the cassettes, and I remember an album by Propaganda saying something like, why should we basically protect patterns of audio on this album? Just copy it. And I think it's important to have this very blunt approach to how we say things and to call things for what they are, in the sense of dissecting the ideas that are put in our heads sometimes, right? So I think it's important to be critical and do things in our own way and just get them done.
Yeah, I'd love to follow up on Emilio's point. I think I can't agree more on the open source ethos being the sort of the punk and the Solarpunk kind of literature, in that you can do radical changes. You can create millions of dollars of wealth and destroy millions of dollars of wealth from people that have it now, simply by sharing your own ideas and your own designs. And that can be done on a platform like Appropedia, or it can be done on GitHub, or like there's tens of thousands of places on the internet that can use it, but it depends on this lateral scaling. And so if you design something that's actually useful and beneficial to someone, or maybe just for yourself, and you share those designs after you've made them, especially if they're digitally manufacturable, you've just created possibly millions of dollars of actual real value for other human beings to make their lives better by using the technology that, you know, they need. And that's how open source software works, where most early open source software developers weren't being paid by corporations. They were trying to fix something they wanted. They wanted to make a game. They wanted some sort of utility, and they shared it with the rest of the world. And then other people glommed on, hacked on it, made it better, and fed it back. And so now the entire internet, like if you're watching this now, I guarantee you it ran through a Linux system, which was an open source computer that was designed and built by tens of thousands of basically volunteers. Now, many of them now are paid to do it because there's a very strong business case for doing open source. But it was hackers. It was people trying to scratch their own itch. And now with digital fabrication tools where we can take waste plastic in our communities, run it through a recycle make filament, run that through an open source 3D printer, we can make literally millions of products that have already been shared on the web. And you can be a part of that too, because you're probably interested or have something that's special about you where you could design something for yourself, your family, your friends, and taking a very tiny bit of extra effort and sharing it with the rest of the community makes it so everybody that can then have the value that you've put into it. I can't say enough about how we actually could create a world of abundance if we all simply shared. And by doing that aggressively, we also stop people from locking down those concepts so that they can't be patented and held away from us to create scarcity for everyone. So the more that we share, the faster that we do it, the better off we all are going to be. And it goes all the way back to like biblical golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Wouldn't it be great if all the technologies, all the products that you could ever want were shared freely and openly on the web so that you could download them, manufacture them in your own location, and get kind of whatever you wanted? And I might disagree with Sophie slightly that I think we can actually have as much as you want. Like when it comes down to it, how many cars do you really, really want? Probably just one or maybe none if you are completely designing for a kind of a nice life. And so you can get that particular thing that you want without having to have scarcity by having radically reduced cost with sharing. And solar happens to be one of those technologies that radically decreases your overall costs if it's deployed right, and particularly if you build it yourself.
And of course, then I have to add that the SolariseCon is totally free and it's totally open, and it's going to be on YouTube. And that's why we want to share with as many people as possible and include as many voices as possible without having any barrier and any entry level. So that is, a real Solarpunk approach. So thank you very much for that. I even go farther and say that at the moment, I believe that capitalism is the brake on progress, is really the element that is stopping us from an incremental and open source and shared knowledge. Because as Appropedia or many other websites or aggregators are proving, people can increment other people's knowledge, and that's the way it works. And at the moment, the limiting element is exactly the approach of private property and IP and copyrights and all these patents and stuff like that. So I'm really happy to share this. Okay, I think we have probably one question more. Let's see. Okay, I will pick up this one. Can you all touch on how land use, zoning, etc., can be used to reduce energy needs? Unless I just missed it. Okay. Anybody wants to add on this?
I could maybe talk a little bit about that just from the Canadian context. So I mentioned agrivoltaics before, where you put a solar farm and you try to grow crops under it, or maybe you have sheep eat the grass underneath the solar park. So you're feeding the sheep, you get the wool and the meat, and you don't have to use herbicides or cut the grass. And so there's lots of different approaches to this, but it just so happens that where I live now in Ontario, it's illegal. So people that were trying to do the right thing were concerned that solar suddenly became super economic in Ontario, and companies were flooding in all over the place to build these giant solar farms. And so they wanted to protect the farmland, kind of protect the heritage of the communities. So they just banned them. And so there's entire tracts of land, mostly kind of circling Toronto, which is the most populous city, that you just aren't allowed to build solar at all. And now, as the technology's evolved, we've gotten to the point where not only would you continue to have your agriculture, whatever you happen to be growing, but it would actually get better. And it's illegal to do it. And so there's a fundamental change that needs to come with the zoning and the regulations in order to be able to allow this new technology to flourish, at least in this province. And I'm sure I know throughout the rest of the world, depending on where you are, for example, some communities ban putting solar panels on your house for aesthetic reasons. And the solar industry is maybe addressing that in a slight way with kind of like incognito panels that, they look like normal shingles, they look like Japanese roof tiles, and you can't tell that they're solar panels. And so that part of it, and part of it is the window solar panels that are partially transparent, so they just look like tinted windows, so you can still get a little bit of power. But we need a big shift, like when we're thinking about the big picture of we're destroying Earth's capacity to have the sort of environment that we're used to. Whether or not you like exactly what the solar panels look like on your neighbor's house is really pretty far down the list of importance. And so changing things like the regulations on those in those local areas needs to happen, and it's going to come from grassroots level activist support.
Thank you. Anybody else want to add on this? Okay. Then I think we're almost there. So I'll just wrap up. It's been really pleasant, and I really appreciate the level of expertise and experience that you share with us. I will remind the audience that we are running another panel in just 15 minutes. I will just share the link here. You can find it down also in the description of the YouTube page. And the next panel is going to be at 5:30, and it's going to be about, is Solarpunk just another style? With moderator Pavel and Commander Jugendstil, Quiros, and Dustin Jacobus. So it's really been a pleasure, and I hope we can have more conversation in the near future. Thank you very much, and take care, and see you soon. Okay?
Thank you.
Thanks so
Bye.
much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Lovely to meet you all.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
nice to meet you.
Cheers.